This is our sixth episode of the Stafford Beer Braided the Firm General Intellect Reading Group. And we are beginning part 2 of the book, or perhaps we're starting part 2 of the book because this is the second beginning of the book here, as Beer puts it. At the beginning of the summary of part 2, he says to reread the summary of part 1. So I will do that right now, just to follow Beer's instructions here. All right. So we begin chapter 1 by trying to understand what is special about today's managerial problems. There does indeed seem to be something unique, and it has to do with the rate of change. It could be that the lags in our systems of implementation are longer than the average interval of new technological impacts. If so, there is bound to be trouble. The tool which we have, which might have coped with this problem because it is fast and flexible, is the electronic computer. But we have not understood how to use it. This book is about what to do next. We need a new insight, which the science of cybernetics can provide. I like to see straightforward English wherever possible, but I have not been able to write this book without introducing some new terms. They are there to name new concepts or concepts which come from other sciences. If chapter 2 is read carefully and the reader doggedly refuses to be put off, he will be armed with the first set of tools he needs. There is a special glossary of cybernetic terms at the back of the book so that people can refresh their understanding if necessary. You may well find that these strange terms soon become old friends. They deserve to be, or I should not have bothered to introduce them. Next, chapter 3, we start to use the tools. Here, the really fundamental problem of management is discussed and analyzed. It is the problem of complexity, how to measure it, how to manipulate it. We think of our problems as concerned with such things as men, materials, machinery, and money, and their interaction. It is just that interaction that causes the difficulties, and we must get at its nature. We must also get at the nature of the way huge numbers of states in a system soak each other up, which is the subject of Ashby's law. It turns out that organization exists precisely to implement that cybernetic law. By the end of chapter 3, the fundamental reasons should be clear why things cannot be organized down to the last iota, and why, in human terms, we should not even want to try. Of course, we all know that they cannot be so organized, that indeed an awful lot of things just organize themselves. But when we know exactly why, we can approach the problem of how. This is the subject of chapter 4, the nature of self-organization in very large systems. By understanding these principles properly, we may well be able to facilitate regulation without imposing it, and that is something all good managers try to do. There are some more new words here, which experience again shows to be useful to managers, with an account of a deceptively simple little machine which I call an algorithm. I have explained why in the text. But why another new word? The answer is that no one has actually isolated this mechanism before, and therefore it has no name. We all know about it, but the intention of cybernetics is to try to make such vaguely understood tricks perfectly explicit and clear, so that we really know how to use them. In chapter 5, the simple algorithm node is used as a building block to construct a larger system, and the object of understanding that system is to discover the meaning of hierarchy in organizations. Hierarchies are needed for fundamental reasons given in logic when big systems are becoming organized. When they are translated into human terms, they seem to be all about power and prestige, with the result that people lose sight of their real nature and meaning in the system. By the end of part 1, we should have glimpsed a totally new perception of the nature of management and of how to approach its task of organization and control. Please do not despair if the practical relevance of all this is by no means clear yet. As the preface says, part 1 establishes some talk. We shall start talking this talk in part 2. All right, so we're going to start talking the talk in part 2. Let's see. Any general thoughts about the summary of part 2? hands up. All right, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, it is remarkable that like it's well, we've got all this out of the way, now we can start talking the talk, right? One line really jumped out at me, that models are more than analogies. They are meant to disclose the key structure of the system under study. I think this gets to something that is often misunderstood about the concept of model, right? It's often, I guess this is like, I think maybe a thing we talked about on a as yet unpublished GIU thing of the, what was that thing Wark was going on about, like the difference between metaphor and metanim, right? Where a metaphor compares two things as being similar in structure, but actually quite dissimilar, and then transfers some understanding from one domain to another. Whereas if you phrase things in terms of metanim, you're kind of actually suggesting that the things are contiguous. Like it's when we think about, say, the metabolic rift or Marx's kind of like concepts of these kind of social metabolisms, it's not that the world is like a metabolism. It literally has a metabolism. That's kind of the transfer, the kind of into the metanym kind of sphere. And I think Beer is getting at something similar here, that the models are not just analogies. It's not just about, oh, look at these two very dissimilar things that have some rhetorical similarity or some sort of thing. He's actually saying these things literally are very similar to each other. There is a continuity between domains. And a model, to be actually useful, has to do that. It has to suggest a continuity across domains rather than just being like, if you squinted at an elephant is kind of like a mouse or whatever. It's like there actually has to be continuity there. That's actually a really bad example because it's not actually what I was talking about. But
yeah,
no, I described.
Go ahead, Lauren. If anyone wants to speak, please put your hand up so I can just call you.
Oh, okay, thank you. No, and that sums up every experience I've ever had trying to construct like any kind of model in a workplace environment, whether it's a model to implement like in the public or a model for your own private firm, or So I got that.
Right, Shane, and then Rudy.
Yeah, just a brief thing. It's like I've had similar things of like trying to explain stuff in like tech organizations, whatever, or trying to like even pitch the idea of like social organization or these kind of mechanics of social organization. And it's like, I'm not saying that your group is like a machine. I'm saying that it literally is a machine. You should treat it as such. That it can be very hard to get through to people with that.
Rudy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think here you have the idea of in the cybernetic brain between the science of the science of enframing and the science of performance, and how Beer is very, very clear in saying this is when you have science of should do this, and this is when you should do this. He's not putting in those terms, but I found it really great.
So you're saying then that the form of modeling that Beer is describing is performative?
But it's not only performative, because echoing Lauren, that sometimes you just, or even also Shane, that you both said like, oh, this, if you squint, it looks like it, like that. That's not enough. So that would be pure science of performance, which you see a lot in complexity, which is why I came to despise a lot of complexity theory during my applied math postdoc. But then he knows, sometimes Beer knows, when you say, okay, this is when you actually have to dissect this. While here it's where you can't dissect it and you just have to be good with squinting.
I see. Okay. I think we will get quite a bit more into this question of what makes a good model in our chapter. And any other sort of thoughts about the summary of part 2? Okay, I will just read up to our description of chapter 6, and then we'll get on to chapter 6. We can now start talking the talk. The object is to construct a model of the organization of any viable system. The firm is something organic which intends to survive, and that is why I call it a viable system. There are many examples of such systems in nature, yet instead of using any of those, which are known to work, as models of the firm, we try to use organization charts that are really devices for apportioning blame when something goes wrong. They specify responsibility and the chain of command instead of the machinery that makes the firm tick. The problem is discussed at the outset, chapter 6, as is the very nature of a model. Models are more than analogies. They are meant to disclose the key structure of the system under study. So if we want to understand the principles of viability, we had better use a known to be viable system as a model. And that is why Part 2 embarks on an account of the way the human body is organized and controlled by its nervous system. We could have used another viable system, such as the amoeba or a whole animal species, as the model. The results are the same, as they must be if viability as such has its own laws and enshrines its own principles, as cyberneticians contend. But the human body is perhaps the richest and most flexible viable system of all. Besides, there is an extra advantage. All of us have bodies, and inevitably we have a good deal of insight into their characteristics. Most people know little, however, about how it all happens. For that reason, there has to be quite a lot of explanation about the physiology of the nervous system. And this is what we're going to see in Chapter 7. So, I do think it is interesting here. Beer is saying, well, you know, it would in principle be just as good to use any other known viable system as our model in order to demonstrate the principles of viability or the principles of cybernetics. But I think what really makes the basis of the VSM in the human body useful is the second point that Beer brings up, which is that we all have a certain intuitive grasp of how the human body works, or at least we can examine our own bodies and make analogies to what is being said in the model and what is being described in the physiological chapter in Chapter 7. Because I'm skeptical that the human body is in fact the richest and most flexible viable system of them all. I'm not really sure that's true. That might just be human bias speaking. But at the same time, I do agree with the point that he's making about how intuitive it is to use our bodies as models for organization. Brett, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm also not terribly convinced I agree with him in terms of, like, all viable systems are necessarily interchangeable. Maybe it's just my good leftist thinking that has gotten to me, but I'm very skeptical of the claim that you can just sort of change things out and it's the same. I get what his point is, but I'm just inherently skeptical of that.
Right, fair enough. Lauren and then Brett, was it? Brett, you were just turning yours off, I think. So Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about analogies too much since I know we're not here to talk about analogies. But I think like what it did for me, just like reading that sentence, I like my whole career experience like just made sense because I've been a bid developer. Like I've been that person writing that org chart with those responsibilities to fit like the client brief that we're pitching for on a bid. And I've also like been in very volatile sort of hierarchies within an organization. And why I found reflecting upon looking at that org chart that I used to be in and comparing it to an analogy of it being a central nervous system, I was trying to say, like the flow of consciousness kind of cascades down from like your CEO to like your managing director down to like your little people. And there's no sort of like communication back up. There's only ever communication back up when shit goes wrong. And it's like, okay, now we need to have like a meeting to talk about how we can make things better for our analysts and the people at the bottom who do all the shit and don't have a way to communicate back up to the top. Whereas if you look at like a nervous system or like my body, it's like if I think like, oh, I'm going to go pick up that pan handle that's been on the oven and grab it, my hand's going to tell me like, hey, that shit hurts. Like, stop doing that. You're hurting me. And then you get that like communication instantaneously as opposed to like the old model that we are familiar with, which is do the thing you get told to do. You hate doing the thing's inefficient, the thing sucks. And then you go months and then you have like a meeting to say, okay, well, our managing director sucks. How can we get him to do his job better? And I don't know, I'm rambling now, but that was my experience, like thinking about that framing.
Yeah, it's certainly like indicative of the kinds of organizations we might like to have in terms of like, yeah, our bodies work pretty well for the most part, and they communicate the things we need to know for the most part, and our organizations don't do either of those things. So let's go to Steve.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the framing of this in terms of the organization charts there to account or to assign blame, and accountability so people can cover their asses is, quite the opposite of what we're trying to do to get to an actual functional system. So that was a nice, succinct way of framing it. But the comment I wanted to make, harkening back to the earlier point about not being convinced about, the human body as being either fully viable or necessarily the best example. Yeah, of course, I agree with that too. But, he makes the claim throughout about how what he's really interested in, this gets a little bit ahead, but what he's really interested in is the invariant features of all viable systems. And, he's making the claim that since the human body is kind of by definition a viable system, so we should use that as a model and then not worry about the other things. But it certainly begs the question of like, well, maybe a comparative study between the amoeba, the animal species, and the human, in terms of what the viability that is shared, the invariant features shared by the three of those systems or whatever, might be, also illustrative. And as far as I know, he doesn't really do that. And of course, knowing what I know about the VSM in anticipation, it's very human-centric and laid out like the central nervous system in a way that maybe the amoeba isn't like that, and maybe that doesn't matter. But that bias might, put him, paint him into a corner later on, and we never really know if we just look through the myopic and narrow view of the human body.
Right. So I think there are really two things there. Like the first one is getting at general scientific principles of viability, which can be done through comparative studies of different viable systems, and that's going to advance our understanding of cybernetics. But the VSM is not a purely analytical model. As Beer describes at the beginning of the book, he wrote this book with the mind that the text and the reader were subsystems in interaction with one another. And I do think that using the human body is a useful communication device, even if there may be greater cybernetic insights that could be gained from a more comparative or sort of like multi-dimensional presentation. It's just that, as you said, like we need to be a little bit careful about assuming that we can generalize from this one case. I just think Beer, for the purposes of communication, is doing this, and it does make sense in that regard. Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, like the absolute like rigor of the model is like a little like, I'm kind of just taking it as an assertion and just, kind of seeing where he goes with it. Because I mean, like it would be really hard to actually, but it would be pretty hard to falsify minimally. But I don't know what, and like this is also kind of putting the cart before the horse, and maybe just sort of using confirmation bias to map something that I'm already kind of into. But I mean, like I feel like it does map onto an amoeba, even if even if there is no nervous system. Like they have like networks of like chemical receptors that do change it over like even long time scales, and like it's a very different kind of intelligence than like something with a spine. But I mean, like it is, and I feel like you can map pretty much every part of the VSM onto some part of of an amoeba.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I feel like there's probably a like kind of first year introduction to viability studies textbook that is yet to be written that would give you all these different examples and sort of like say like, hey, here are general principles of viability, blah, blah, blah. It's just, maybe it's not a management text. Maybe it is more of, first year science textbook. Shane, go ahead.
Just kind of basically echoing what Matt said. But to really clarify something here, yes, Beer is focusing on the invariant features. Like it's almost a tautology, right? Like he's only focusing on the things that are invariant across different instances, and so it's suitable to then compare them across instances. But the invariant features are functional. So that the feature that is shared will be a function, but not necessarily a physiological or even structural similarity. So the amoeba regulates its internal fucking bullshit, whatever it has inside, via, I don't know, amino whatevers. And the human body regulates the same thing, but via glucose or something like that, right? Like these are functionally the same, but not like actually kind of like physiologically the same. And it can be, I think this is where it resonate with Steve, right? That like it can be a bit of a trap to only think of the human body sort of analogy stuff as being the main feature here. Because I think something I noticed quite a bit in Beer's writing is that he'll have these kind of like general sort of concepts, and then he'll pull out an example that feels really far out of left field. But then when you look at it, it's like, oh yeah, he's totally right. Like the in Designing Freedom, he talks about like the regulation of the department store as an example of Ashby's law. And like that initially struck me as like, wow, where's he going with that? And then, but like, he is right. The functions are all identical, but the form is completely wildly divergent, right? Like, such that if you're only looking at the human, the specifically anthropomorphic features, you'll definitely miss all of the actual kind of like functional invariance going on there. So just keep function in mind all the time here. He's only concerned with function. He's actually kind of not really concerned with the material formal components at all.
Right, except to the extent that we have an entire chapter on physiology in chapter 7, right? So like, these, you know, it's an illustrative example that's going to get at the functions, and it's the one he's going with here. But you know, he's also bringing in examples about existing organizations and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, we'll see how it goes. But I think we're all kind of on the same page with this. And I think you're absolutely right about the importance of looking at this from a functional perspective. Okay, so let's talk about Chapter 6. We'll start off, I guess, at the very beginning here. The firm, which is the entity a manager controls, is a good example of a system of high complexity in which the input and output are themselves high-variety subsystems. What connects the input to the output is the domestic firm itself. That is, the men, materials, machines, and money, which are based in particular locations with a company sign outside. The whole complex of activity going on inside is an anastomotic reticulum. What sort of description of all this would be useful in discussing such typical managerial problems as organization, efficiency, and objectives? The orthodox answer to this question is of the following kind. We need an org chart of some sort which will identify how each part of the business relates to each other part, with the main intention of determining where responsibilities lie. Since part might mean anything less than the whole, we may have a set of organization charts. In this, the major parts are first exhibited, and the minor parts are exhibited later in subsidiary charts, which could carry the detail down to individual people at the lowest organizational level if need be. These charts are, or more usually are not, but could be supported by detailed jobs descriptions intended to show how the whole thing works. So the charts themselves specify an anatomy of management, while the job description specifies physiology. All right. Any comments on this? Brett, go ahead, and then Lauren.
Yeah, I hope this is not too far afield, but this whole chapter, especially this beginning part, just reminded me of like I took a class on Disney, but we ended up going into like the metaphysics of a corporation, like what even is a corporation, and like that's like the way he said like, oh, it's just got like a collection of org charts with some sign out front.
Yeah. It's not like, you know, different theories of what a corporation is. It's a person. It's a set of org charts with a sign out front. You know, it is an entity a manager controls. That's Beer's maybe description here. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of like how an org chart is like an anatomy, but it's like a very normative anatomy, so it doesn't account for like idiosyncrasies or non-normative like forms. And like as people come in all sorts of forms and like have their own like ways of being. And I felt this like really strongly when I was helping on a bid for this like really massive transport thing that involved trains and ferries and paratransit and a bunch of other stuff. And in practice, the way they operated was the ferries were so small, the team just reported straight to like a managing director, but buses, paratransit, and everything else had a bit more complexity. And so there was like a manager between like each of those divisions to manage that communication, smooth that communication between them. But on the org chart, it looked messy and disgusting because you had like this ferry team reporting straight to like your managing director, and then this other chain of managers for every other division. And they were like, well, this looks kind of messy, so we'll just create a ferry manager that we don't need. So the org chart will like look normative, will follow the types of organizational charts that we expect to see. And it just didn't work at all for like what like functions were actually going on in that thing.
Right. So, I guess this would perhaps be a bit of the danger that you are pointing to, Shane, where you get stuck on anatomical structures and differences, and maybe it's like, oh, the anatomy of an org chart must be symmetrical. That is a sort of a priori principle of org charting. So we must have a director for the ferry section, because otherwise we'll lose our symmetry. When that's just has literally nothing to do with any of the people involved. Okay, anyone else want to comment on this little blurb at the front? Okay, so I think a very important thing here is that the charts specify an anatomy of management, while the jobs description specify its physiology. So this is, on the face of it, sounds like a complete description, because you have entities and you have functions, right? Like you have the anatomy, which is what is the thing, and then you have the physiology, which is what does the thing do. So it's like, yeah, looks good, seems to check out. Okay, cool. Which is perhaps the reason why this managerial method continues to be used pervasively in 2020, when Beer wrote this book in like, what was it, like 71 or something? So things haven't changed much at all, as we can see from Lauren's example. All right, so let's go on. All right, so far so good, but we are left with the question as to how all this is to be done. There are normally, I speak from fairly extensive observation, 3 phases in this task. The firm has not to be invented, it is there. First and foremost, then, the task is one of description. But whoever sets out to supply the description knows a lot about this kind of structure in advance. He knows about the basic divisions of firms into parts such as production and sales. He knows about the functional divisions which are commonly used. For instance, there are line and staff relationships. Thus, he will, for example, expect to find an accounting function which will be staff, groups of middle managers, line responsible to senior managers, and so on. He may well expect, what is more, a good deal of disagreement about certain twilight areas, of which production control and management accounting are both typical. We shall see why in a moment. So I wanted to clarify some of the terminology used here, because it is a little bit business school, and maybe not super clear, because he doesn't spell it out. It's just kind of assumed that this book is written for managers, and managers will know what this stuff is. So first of all, line and staff relationships. So this comes from a military organization, right? You have the staff officers and line officers. Staff, like the general staff, is going to be in charge of general understanding, general functionality, the sort of overall regulation of the system, whereas line is concerned with more lower level, immediate practical tasks. And then we have these terms, which I have heard before, but hadn't really heard that much before reading this book: production control and management accounting. So production control is essentially making sure that the different parts of the organization are taking in inputs and producing outputs in the right proportions according to demand and supply. And this is sort of like the overall plans of the organization. So this is kind of like the input-output stuff that we've been talking about previously. And then management accounting is going to be important because it's accounting, but because it's essentially doing budget allocation, it ends up taking on managerial roles, even though in theory accounting is kind of like a passive activity. So he's saying like these two areas end up screwing up the whole line staff division, and they end up screwing up the production sales division. And so, you know, anybody who's going to make one of these org charts already knows that this is going to be screwed. But nonetheless, an org chart they will make. All right, so let's go to Matt.
Yeah, was thinking like maybe the reason why like the chain of blame thing is the thing that gets reified is just like the time scale like that it operates on. Because like, you know, on some level, like these legal things, like, you know, like they don't really change that often. So, you know, like that kind of makes sense to map out in a chart. But, you know, like, especially in like kind of a big organization where like, you know, you might be working in pairs on different projects in different weeks. Like, you know, how would you actually map that out? Like, I guess that's what Beer did when he was doing consulting. But I mean, like that changes way too fast. And like, and so, you know, it winds up being this thing where, you know, because that's the thing everyone can see, that's what winds up generalizing to other stuff and just screwing people up.
Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought this came to me like off of that, which is the kind of, I think it's like situational irony or like some kind of irony, and where the org chart acknowledges that it's bad because like every org chart I've written begins with who was responsible when things go wrong, and so it's like this is weird sort of like like ironic acknowledgement that this is wrong because we start with like when things go wrong, this is who is responsible.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, any organization is going to have failures. That's reasonable. You would want to design an organization that is capable of dealing with failure. But probably the right way to design it is not like when something bad happens, the solution is to shoot the cat, right? Like the solution is to get rid of the person who fucked up. And we know who fucked up because the org chart tells us who fucked up. And that's like, well, there we go. Viability. We've done it. So yeah, totally. All right. So second phase of the job. Here, he describes, so he says, the second phase of the job involves not only description, but prescription. Whoever is undertaking this task has a limited number of concepts to work with, if he remains orthodox, concepts which are generally current with the manager concerned. He has a limited collection of physical equipment too, basically a two-dimensional piece of paper and as many ways of drawing on it in thin, thick, dotted, and colored lines as he thinks people can stomach. And I've very much seen this in work before. In the 2008 crisis, I was working at a public small university, and the administrator there was dealing with the prefecture and trying to keep the school open, and there was all these discussions and meetings going on. And one day, the dean or the school president showed up with an org chart of astonishing complexity, and it was just like everyone was shaking their head, like, how is this supposed to help us in any way at all? Shade, go ahead. Or sorry, Shade, go ahead.
Yeah, I just find this bit about like having this very limited vocabulary and a limited tool set, and then having the comparatively high variety of like the number of different ways that you can draw colored lines up to the point where it's nauseating, as being this like compensating force. Like you have a fundamentally just insufficient tool set, and so the way to make up for it is to put as much shit on the PowerPoint slide as possible and just drive people insane. And maybe if they go nuts looking at all your colored lines, they won't notice that it's all bullshit, right?
Well, and it's exactly the same problem we just ran into in the previous chapter with that circuit diagram, right? Like it's too complicated. It just doesn't convey the information that's needed, and so we had to get a very nice computer model of it, which is awesome, and we'll share that when we publish this thing. Okay, so blah blah blah. If he is knowledgeable about management theory, he will also have quote unquote principles to guide him. These principles: 1 boss for 1 man. 5 is the ideal number of immediate subordinates. You should not mix a line and staff responsibility in 1 man. Are distillations of managerial culture. There must be some substance in them, but I put the matter kindly. And this reminds me completely of when we were reading Gletkin's article about about Taylor and the problems with using rules of thumb and sort of folk knowledge as managerial principles. Is like, well, yeah, maybe there's some substance in them, but who knows? They're just heuristics that are untested and just kind of go around in manager books. Like, 15 ways to solve your organization from experts. How do we know they work? We don't, but they are authorities, so we're just going to take it from authority. Okay. Then we get to the third phase of the process, which is essentially the whole thing fucks up. The whole sorry exercise comes to its inevitable conclusion. So the formal statement of the company structure is that in the managing director's office is typically something we are working towards, something we know needs revising, or something we are updating through a process of evolution. As to the job descriptions, where they exist, they turn out to be descriptions of men and not of jobs at all. For the fact that jobs do not do themselves, but men do them. And the result is that people describe what the man is doing, or what the boss thinks the man ought to be doing, and not any such impersonal thing as a job. If a big clinical effort is made to describe the job, the odds are that no actual man can be found to fill it. So the job has to change. Actual company structures are heavily dependent on the particular people who fill the acknowledged roles, and when those particular people leave the structure the structure often has to change. So we saw earlier that we had the anatomy and physiology, but actually the physiological description is complete bunk. It's just anatomy. It's just describing who's there and putting a fancy name on it. Shade, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's this entity thinking that Beer cautions against so often, right? That we mix up people for functions because people have a kind of immediate phenomenological reality to us, and it's actually kind of tricky to think in terms of functions instead. And this is really fucking difficult stuff, right? Because I think there's something about our kind of neural apparatus that actually leads us to go astray in this kind of way quite often. And I notice sometimes with people when I kind of talk about this stuff, right, and this kind of like shifting the attention onto functions, they often get a bit spooked that because I think one of the kind of nostrums of management is that we're all about people, that kind of shit, like the fucking very neo-lib kind of supposedly softly kind of stuff of like, oh, we really care about people here. And it's not that you shouldn't care about people, but the problem may be that the thing you are dealing with may not in fact be a person. Right. And if you only focus on, it's like looking at all the Lego bricks and failing to see the castle that they're making, right? That if you're only focusing on the Lego bricks, you'll miss the entire fucking point. But like it's the functions and the like relations between the people and all the dynamic stuff. That's the thing you're actually managing. Managing people is kind of a triviality in some ways. It's the weird shit that people do that needs to be managed.
Well, yes, I think that's certainly true to a point. There is the other thing, though, that happens in organizations, and I was talking with Lauren about this yesterday after reading, and it's that organizations are organized according to who can get along with whom. And in that case, the people are very important. In fact, the people are actually the determining factor, not the functions at all.
Right.
The function is simply who can stand to be in the same room as this other person. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, I very much recall sitting down in like one of our office planning days for the coming year and looking at the managers we had on hand in our tiny office. And there was only like one that was really interested in managing analysts. And like we had a director who helped people but wasn't responsible for anyone because he hated like managing other people. And then like our managing director, likewise, like I reported to him, but he hated managing people as well. So I didn't really have a manager. I don't think I needed one, but I think like Veer mentioned being in that spot of like being very junior, but then not really having a hierarchical structure to buffer like him from the managing director. And yeah, just like the arbitrariness that went into like, well, I don't really feel like managing anyone. So next year, I think it makes sense if Laura just managed by Richie. And I remember like feeling a very heated feeling of having to hold myself back from saying like, I will fucking quit on the spot. Like, I swore, but like, I will quit on the spot if like Richie's my manager going forward. And yeah, I had a lot of feelings reading this chapter.
Brett, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm also reminded of bullshit jobs where like some people just exist and they don't really have a function. They're just there, which is sort of my position right now. But I don't know. That reminded me of that.
Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I co-sign. Like I've also been a part of designing bids in rooms where there's been a lot of like delicate egos, and it comes to time for like project renewal, and it's like, well, like. Bob sucks, but Bob's liked by everyone, so he's going to have a job on this team, even if he isn't good at it. And then you have to like buffer in people to make up for like Bob's deficiencies, and like there's a lot of stuff that goes into that kind of thing that is missed by looking at it like an objective like organizational chart with purpose and meaning and stuff.
Okay, and Shane.
Yeah, just like maybe it was Brett's thing there of like, why is this like this person doesn't seem to actually do anything on thing? Well, no, they're clearly like stepping up to a meta level. Their function is to sit there like a cuckoo and prevent anyone else from sitting there. Their function is to occupy space and prevent any other person from being in that space. Yeah, so it's pathological stuff, right?
And Brett,
just real quick, I think it's the was it Beer that came out that said the function of a machine is what it does? Mm-hmm. Or the function of a system is what it does. The function of a job is what it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so when we get to these questions of sort of interpersonal dynamics and how they are actually determining for the structure of organizations, we haven't talked about this yet in the book, and it isn't covered in this book. Very much, or sorry, in this chapter very much. But I think the sort of reconciliation we can get here is that you need to kind of do like, like family system dynamics understanding of this stuff to essentially understand what the underlying functional structure is that causes these people to behave so dysfunctionally and ultimately gum up the works of the organization entirely. So like, why is it that all managers are assholes? And why do they always inevitably become assholes? And why do these particular managers behave these particular ways? I'm not saying you could just like erase individual personality characteristics, but there are definitely functional dynamics that encourage the creation of certain working personalities, and also, can foster feuds and so on. So I think that's kind of the reconciliation we might get at here, which is not to say that we're going to build a better org chart, because org charts are shit, but we might get a better organizations. Lauren, go ahead.
Sorry, I feel like a lot of talking. But I think too, what is interesting is how perception of self like plays into these org charts, and especially for folks at the top who like have a more of a say over what that structure looks like. How like I remember on that project that for renewal, there was one guy who had on the previous project been the director, but he'd gotten in some arguments with the client, and so they were like, we really can't like keep him as the director, so we kind of have to demote him to like managing director and put this guy up as director now, and like that being a very delicate issue because it was this perception that he's being demoted, or like he somehow was inadequate at his previous job, and if we move him, that's an acknowledgement of that, and like we can't do this.
Right, and that gets at the whole functions of the compensation system in the organization. Okay, great. So breakdown happens, and this is another thing I was talking about with Lauren. This very final sentence of this paragraph, which is that you end up with indispensable people in the organization who have job descriptions that are written to describe what they do, because they are the only thing holding the organization together. And once that person leaves, the job description, which describes exactly the person who is indispensable, cannot be filled because people are unique to some degree, and your odds of finding a clone of the person who just left are not very good. Brett.
Yeah, my organization, and I have no idea why they did this, but they decided to name entire divisions after people. So like it's the Bergstrom division, or like in our entire like billing system, and our entire organization is based on like the managers who are technically oversee them. The whole organization is based on that, and it's ridiculous.
I believe that's often referred to as feudalism. Like the Habsburg house, the York house, and so on. All right, great, wonderful. Okay, we then have a discussion about how line and staff officers or managers or workers can actually have skill sets that are at odds with their position in the hierarchy, and therefore they end up doing jobs that are not actually covered by their line or staff position. And this reminded me a lot of debates that happened in the 90s about Japanese political science, or in Japanese political science, about the organization of Japanese politics. And something that American scholars, for the most part, were perplexed by was that the map and the territory in Japanese politics were often very highly at odds with one another. That you had someone who had a relatively junior position in the organization, but was actually like the shadow power broker who was running the whole thing. And they were like, how can the org chart and the organization not match each other? These inscrutable Orientals. And I think what we see here is that, like, really this is a difference more that is a matter of degree rather than a difference of kind. Because what Beer is describing with, like, the production manager and the chief metallurgist is basically the same thing. It's people have competencies and relationships that don't fit the org chart, and the way the organization actually works, just it isn't the same thing. Anyway, that was kind of interesting to me, coming from my old Asian studies background. So that is all invented. Even so, real life is just like that, and it is a lot of fun. It's a great way to put it. It's a lot of fun. How's work? It's a lot of fun. It would be disastrous if some neurotically disposed chairman or consultant tried to insist that everyone behave like the org chart. But the question is whether real life in the firm is best described by this three-phase effort, and whether, if so, a structure specified like this really helps best in solving the problems that arise in transferring input to output are unanswered. I shall answer them quite flatly in the negative, and for three key reasons. So yes, it doesn't work. First, the mode of description is wholly arbitrary. So, more or less, he says that this form of management derives from a scale where, in like sort of the classical capitalism phase, or the phase of like the true family-owned business bourgeois era, you had a level of management that was kind of human scale, where people's individual intellectual and emotional capacities were adequate to the scale of production they were doing. But that just doesn't map on to what we live with today at all. And we're still using this bullshit from managerial culture from the sort of early bourgeois developments. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I love this section, right, because it really nails down where this thing comes from. Because the org chart emerges in response to a problem. But the problem here is, firstly, it's the sort of personal, private tyranny of the sort of entrepreneur or whatever. But that's not really the problem. It's the delegation, right? The problem arises when the size of the problem grows too large for the tyrants to keep everything on the rails. And so they must delegate. Therefore, they must need a kind of way of accounting for this delegation. And that's your org chart, right? The hierarchy. And the explicit problem that it's solving is the pushing downwards of decision-making away from the body of the tyrant and down through the micro-tyrants. That's all it does. That is the entire function of the org chart. It does nothing else aside from allow the tyrant to depersonalize some of his decision-making capability and push it downwards. That's the extent of it. That's the problem that it arose in answer to. If we don't actually face that problem, we should not in any way imitate or use this thing. It is not a general feature of reality. It's not a general feature of human social structures, anything like that. It is a very specific answer to a very specific problem. He calls it like the history of management. It's very historically specific, this. And I think this kind of section here, these couple of paragraphs really, for me, like the problem with this, like the Leninist party form or whatever, or the kind of the typical left organizing, or even the structure of unions and so on. These couple of paragraphs kill that shit stone dead. Mm-hmm. Like it is, this stuff is simply unsuitable for the task. It is very suitable for a very particular task, but it is not suitable for these tasks in general. Sorry, folks, just ain't gonna fucking work. So it is imperative that we shift our thinking off of this org chart, hierarchical, tyrant delegation stuff. Just get it all out of your head, get a different model. I like the historical specificity of this.
Yeah, so I think it's there's a mention later in this chapter about the sort of uselessness of the line staff division, and that's pretty much the entire Leninist political model is the line staff division, because it's a military organization designed for the purposes of civil war, and it is created on the line staff lines, and that's why you have secrecy in the way that you do, and you have decision making among the sort of Politburo or whatever. It's just that model.
And it is today strictly and absolutely fucking worthless. Like there's no argument about it, right? Like it's, and if we can even call
we're
back
not
to
in a civil war.
No, we can also call back to the thing at the very start of the book, right? Absolutum obsoletum. If it works, it's out of date. Now that shit didn't work in the early 20th century, and even if it had, it would be so out of date as to be fucking useless anyway. So, sorry, fucking Leninists, you're just going to have to drop that shit. Like, move on. It's just going to have to fucking happen. You know what I mean? Beer is kind of basically unequivocal about this. It's like, this is not the right model at all. It barely worked in the first place. This, like, society is being structured around this model turned out to be fucking horseshit. Nope, drop it, move on, do something else. That's what the back half of the chapter will be about.
Okay, Matt, and then Lauren.
Yeah, it is interesting how like you mentioned, you know, how the idea waters that you're swimming in, you know, like really just show dictate what questions are asked in the first place. It is wild, like how much of like econ and stuff is, you know, it's not about like optimizing production. It's I mean, some of it is, but I mean, like, a lot of it is these principal agent problems that really are all about just how to have a property owner ensure that they're they can put their enforce their will upon their property, which includes their employees, and I think there's a lot of value in game theory, but it is the questions that are asked are just very clearly like guided by the bourgeoisie, and I think that's one of the most that's one of the areas where you can just see it most strongly.
Yep.
It's like you can also do it for voting systems. You also can do it for structured auctions. That how to mutually have everyone benefit the most. But I mean, and people do that. But so much of it is just how do I complete my contracts? How do I make sure that my employees just do everything I want?
Yep. Yeah. Because that is obviously the most lucrative form of strategizing in a bourgeois society. Okay, Lauren, go ahead.
I'll be quick, because this is like a kind of side tangent, and it's not addressed in this chapter, but it's about sort of how gender plays in with this kind of stuff as well. Because I my previous managing director had a preference for hiring women he could yell at, and that's not a thing you can ever address in the org chart, because gender isn't recognized in org charts. And so I was in the office for a year, and you'd see this pattern develop of he'd hire women who he would then scream at, and then they'd stick around because I hate to generalize, but women are typically quite good at managing sort of really angry men. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, totally, and there's a pretty obvious reason why this stuff is not why gender is not addressed in this book, which is because it is written for a male audience by a man in an extremely male-dominated managerial culture at the time that Beer was writing. So there is a very gendered dimension to this book, which comes through the fact that everybody's referred to as a man in the book. So it's very good. It's good to bring up these things because they don't come up in the chapter, and I kind of expect they're not going to come up in any of the chapters because Beer's just not concerned with it in a really unhelpful way. But yes, that is absolutely a part of how these organizations are structured as well. Okay. Let's move on then. That's the first fuck up. The first reason why it doesn't work.
The second is middle of page 80.
Page 80. Okay.
The lower paragraph.
Right. So, but if arbitrariness was the first reason given for objecting to this orthodoxy, the second is much more powerful. It is that there exists today a capacity to cope with information vastly in excess of the human capacity, with the result that the manager is no longer the arbiter of sophistication and control. He must delegate this role to the electronic computer, just as he delegated other managerial prerogatives in the past, thereby losing them, be it noted, to people who are more expert than he, but junior. And just as he retained his seniority over these juniors, just as he remained in command, just as he used the efforts of his more expert underlings to build a bigger and more profitable firm, so now must he use the computer. The manager no more abdicates in favor of computers because they are more sophisticated in control than he, than in favor of maintenance men because they can keep the plant working and he cannot. But he has to know how to organize the maintenance men to keep the plant working, and he has to know how to organize computers to affect the firm's control. Moreover, he has to organize the plant so it can be maintained. He has also to organize the firm so it can be computed with. There is the rub. People do not want to reorganize their firms. Important. Very important. Especially coming from a managing consultant background. There's the number one problem. People don't want to change. They hire consultants to make plans that get put in drawers. Okay. More particularly, they do not know how to do so. More precisely still, they have no tools or means of description which would enable them to work out a new mode of organization as distinct from a reshuffle of responsibilities. That is one reason for the sermon you've just been reading. We can hardly go on unless we agree that a new language and a new model, something different from the archetypal organization chart, are required. The other reason for the sermon is to warn managers that if they persist in drawing in computers on their existing org charts, they cannot possibly succeed in doing more than bolster the humanly limited control system they have already got. Things may go more slickly. The firm may even save some money, though this is little more than a pious hope in most standard applications, but the human filters remain, and they remain the limitation. All right, so comments on this. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I think one that really jumps out at me is that they must organize the firm so that it can be computed with, to make a computable firm, or and this thing of like organizing the computers and organizing the people and organizing these systems. That what you're setting up is a kind of rig of coprocessors. So it's no longer about the sort of Cartesian model of the sort of brilliant mind of the tyrant motivates action down through the otherwise inert body. You're kind of structuring the body of the organization so that it can compute itself, which is big shift in mindset, right? To distributed kind of machinic cunning, both in like the silicon stuff and just in the kind of like rigging up systems of human interaction that are smart in themselves. That networks of people where the network is smart and the people are smart, that sort of stuff. And yeah, the thing of like the resistance to reorganization, right? That we have this like phase change from like, for a while, the kind of personal tyranny of the staff was enough to keep up with the scale of the problem or whatever. And well, I mean, it was also a shit society to live in, and it still is. But to reorganize to be better requires this complete mode shift and a reorganization. It requires a breakdown of the existing structures and a reconstitution of new structures. It's like that interpretation of like Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs as a reorganizable body, not an unorganized body, but a recombinatorial body, one that is capable of breaking itself down, like a caterpillar, right? Breaks itself down and then reconstitutes as a butterfly. That's the kind of transformation you want. There is the ability to liquidate non-functional structures and have them recombine in smart ways, rather than doggedly sticking to existing forms and familiar forms.
Right. It's like the culture. Yeah. Just to that point. it is interesting to think about what the neoliberals did in the wake of this book. So it's, after the hippies gave up on the counterculture and became yuppies, I think that, and this is also true of the 68ers after 68, a lot of those people who were university students and so on went on to become managers, and in a sense, they were kind of reacting against the managerial culture that Beer is describing here, right? That, this is like the old method of management. We're out with the old, in with the new. The boomers are going to bring a new tide into the organizations, right? Like that sort of idea that we're going to do a march through the organizations. We're going to work within the machine. And I think very much like a lot of the yuppie attitude sort of comes out of these circumstances. And it's also partially, I think, a sort of motivation for support for Thatcherism at that time. The thing is, though, that the yuppies, what that generation ended up doing in Generation X that followed was very much to combine Beer's emphasis on computability with the idea of manager tyranny, because you had at the same time that there was this kind of push against the old Forrest Keynesian management structures. You have at the same time the cult of the entrepreneur and the cult of the CEO that come up. So it's kind of like you can see the road not taken when you read this section and you compare it to what the yuppies actually did. All right, so Steve, go ahead.
Just as another silly anecdote. So I do a lot of work with NASA here in Houston, and I've seen the cyclic changes in how they reorg constantly, and it's interesting just because not only do you have the senseless reorganization and constantly here's a different org chart that comes out every 2 years, maybe that will work. It's also because they're changing the objective function. Every time the administration changes, right? Oh, we're going to the moon. Now we're going to the Mars. Now we're going to an asteroid. And so because it is, a large government agency with thousands of employees now, it's not just how to reorg to be more profitable. It's to fit whatever whims of whatever the administration is. And all they can do, because they don't really have any ability but lower you go down in the chain, is just to say, all right, let's reorganize all the groups and all the divisions. And I've been in so many meetings where it's just a big presentation of the new org chart. And, nothing actually changes. Nobody really talks to anybody any differently, but it's just a stagnating thing, and then of course, everything's behind budget and behind schedule and surprise. So anyway, just fun examples of this in practice where every piece of it is just a massive failure.
Yeah, totally. The sort of cabinet shuffle approach to reorganization is rarely very useful. And I have definitely seen that in the Canadian government as well, with the way that directives come down from the deputy ministers and everybody scrambles, and things do change, but not in very productive ways. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, which I think goes to part of why there is such a resistance to reorganization, because some of it is people just defending their little fortresses, and maybe even a sense that oh, I have a totally bullshit job, it's really just an accident of history that I'm making six figures to check Twitter all day, and so and I now I have all this free time to fight it, so I'll fight it tooth and claw. But there's also loss aversion is a real thing, and it's not just that but you weight losses more heavily than you weight potential gains. So a potential a drop in your salary hurts twice as bad as a raise. Feels good. So that is kind of rational, right? Because really equally weighting gains and losses, that only works when you're playing 10,000 games of poker. When you've just got one life and it's path dependent. There's no reset where it doesn't really matter if the probabilities converge. You've got this one line that you got to not disrupt. And and also reminds me of in Taylor, one of the things he keeps talking about is managers do not want to do any of this stuff. It doesn't matter how much more productive it's shown to be. Even when they've actually seen it, they do not want to go through the process of learning how to define a job and really train their employees to do it.
Yep. Okay, the third key reason for objection to orthodox company descriptions and ways of discussing organizational structure derives from the other two. If the distinctions we currently use are wholly arbitrary and indeed archaic, first objection, and if they are constrained by human limitation in a way which modern facilities falsify, second objection, then there is no guarantee that what really matters in modern management can be expressed like this at all. It is, after all, one thing to express something ineptly, and quite another to have no way of drawing attention to it at all. But this latter tragedy is quite possible, and often happens with any grossly simplifying language. Carbon credits. Let's Brett, go ahead.
I mean, could some of this just be because most things are not really even necessary, or they're just
You cut out, Brett, sorry.
Could it be the structure of capitalism itself that has that's causing some of those problems?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Because the profit motive and especially the tyrannies that Shane was talking about, which are strongly encouraged by capitalism because of the power imbalances that wealth concentration creates. Yeah, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, that's all definitely true. And I think the thing that kind of kept jumping out at me for a lot of this stuff was how we apply this to leftist organizing and so on, especially to Leninist bullshit. But this notion that the stuff that matters may not even be expressible in the given framework, right? That I think that's basically true of fucking everything we see, from the fucking Leninist psycho shit through to DSA and Corbyn and stuff. A lot of it's just not even that it's not expressing the things that matter, it's that it's not capable of expressing them. It's look, we're the show that keeps harping about the culture, right? But in Accession, where they have the outside context problem, which it's something that it's not just that they couldn't deal with it, it's that they couldn't conceive of even being able to deal with it, or they couldn't conceive of the ladder of abstractions they would have to climb up in order to deal with it. And it's just literally just entirely outside of their kind of cognitive framework, and that's for a super advanced kind of culture, right? Yeah, I mean, when we look at all these fucking weirdo sects and stuff, the shit that matters is just categorically not expressible in their fucking framework. They're literally wasting their fucking time,
Yeah, well, for all the reasons that came up in the Revolutionary Strategy series, that's the case. Now we go on to the discussion of basically what Shane just said, blah blah blah. There's an unfortunate reference to savages, but Beer's point is still basically taken. You could say the opposite thing also applies. You try to explain the nuances of a hunting-gathering life to someone like me, and I was I don't even have the vocabulary to, I don't even have the conceptual framework to do that just off. Yeah, you'd have to give me a pretty serious education. The major difficulty about writing this sort of book is that managers are not naive. They know very well the things that really happen. It would be foolishly patronizing to try and instruct them in the subject of real life. But they would in turn condescend to the author if they thought that this was his object. An eminent physicist has said that an intelligent child could solve the most abstruse problems of modern physics if he could only understand what they are about. This is presumably because pure intelligence does not grow, it is an innate ability, and because a child is not encumbered with the languages, structures, and solutions which his elders know, and which actually inhibit their discovery of novelty. I mean, this is a very commonly known problem in science. You have to wait for the last generation of scientists to die in order to make any new discoveries, because their conceptual framework is dominant, and you can't express anything beyond it. That child could do the same for us managers, if he knew very much about real life in business. We, for our part, do know, but we are constrained by our own experience as well as informed by it. In particular, we have a managerial culture in which some things distinctively modern cannot be expressed, although we know them. So this is like interesting. It kind of interfaces with that like unknown unknowns problem. It's like these are like sort of orthogonal ways of understanding that issue, right? Because it's like, yeah, there are unknown unknowns, there are known unknowns, but there's also kind of like known unknown unknowns, which you could gesture towards but can't actually talk about. It's like, yeah, I have a vague sense that this problem exists and I can see the symptoms of it, but I can't really describe what the hell is going on. So yeah, that's maybe an issue that managers run into all the time. Okay, so then we get into the discussion of production control management accounting. I think we talked about this a little bit before in terms of how these things fuck up org charts, but is there any further comments that people wanted to make about this? Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the kind of the important thing to get to here is that, like when you're thinking of like where does the function belong in the org chart? Well, it doesn't actually belong in the org chart. You have to think of this stuff as a network. And as various co-processes that are interrelating, rather than like hierarchical sort of stuff. So it's like just that these things cut across the concerns, they slice across the body of the org chart in such a way that just invalidates the model, and you really do have to like have a different model that can be a bit more kind of network-like and account for these cross-cutting concerns. There's a fair few words here that are kind of just getting to that kind of thing of like. We need something a bit more rhizomatic rather than the tree-like kind of structure.
It reminds me a lot of...
I think that then kind of is the on-ramp into talking about the body as the model.
Right, and it reminds me a lot of countries that built their train networks in the hub and spoke model, where it's essentially like Paris is the hub, everything emanates from Paris, or Bangkok is the hub, everything emanates from Bangkok. You run into all kinds of problems where there's actually connections between regions of the country that are really important, but they can't be expressed in the rail network because the principle is everything goes through the capital. Shane, go ahead.
No, that's just such a fascinating example, right, of that kind of like the degeneracy of that kind of thinking, right, of like the tree thinking, right, where there's a central privileged term and everything else is a leaf, right, which denies the ontological kind of reality and richness of the leaves, right? Well, not really leaves, but in this model they are, and it's the central term that dominates. And what you just end up with then is like, oh, our transport network is kind of fucked because I can't go from one city that's right beside it to another city, right? I have to go through the central term to get back there. Acknowledging the reality of the kind of patchwork quilt that is the sort of world is a much more fruitful way to go about things rather than insisting on central terms and like privileged root terms as having more reality than their leaves counterparts have.
Indeed. All right. Beer talks about that example that Lauren mentioned earlier of being directly under the general manager and like sort of being up against these department managers who have real prestige, but you're just this one person who's at this totally inappropriate level of the organization and you can't fight your fights, and saying, as an experience, by the way, this was considerable hell. And it certainly provoked thought about the company's organization chart. Yeah, totally. Okay, then there is that example of line staff confusion that I brought up earlier when talking about the Leninist organizations. So by all these routes, the arguments from arbitrariness to archaism and from structural inadequacy in the orthodox model, we return to the basic contention. A new model is required which will actually work. Now, the term model has been slipped into this chapter already. People are beginning to appreciate the sense in which a company organization chart is, or at least is meant to be, a model of the real organization. They often get into difficulties, however, with a more elaborate use of the word. So we have the model as a mathematical equation, the model as a theory, the model as a hypothesis, the model as a physical thing. And Beer says, well, you know, you'd be inclined to say, like, the mathematical theory is the most sophisticated and the physical thing is the least sophisticated, because that's like a toy that a kid would play with. But the reality is, the physical thing, it looks the least sophisticated, and yet these people have understood best. We talk about a model ship or a model railway, especially we talk about a working model. In these expressions, four key notions are embedded. There is scaling down in both size and complexity. So there's a model of Shakespeare's birthplace. There is transfer across, whereby actual parts of actual things are represented again in their relative positions. And arising from this, there is workability, by which I mean that the model can, in principle anyway, operate like the original. Thus, a model train actually runs round a model railway, and it looks so much like the thing modeled that cinefilms of models can be substituted for film of actual trains and successfully pretend to be real. That this can be so, although the engine may be delivered by clockwork and no real railway engine was ever so driven, introduces the fourth point. The model is a good model if it is appropriate. Someone watching the film just mentioned is not in the least concerned with how the engine is powered, but an engineering student who dismantled a model railway engine in a technical college and found an enormous coiled spring inside would not be impressed. So, you know, the model train that's used in practical effects is totally appropriate to producing a film because what matters is the visual effect, but it's not appropriate to be used as an instruction device in engineering. And this is something that comes up a lot in computer graphics, right? These kinds of modeling dilemmas. Because a lot of it is the kind that is workable and appropriate in the visual sense, but doesn't actually model the thing that it's supposed to be modeling. It just does it for the purposes of presentation. It's that kind of Potemkin village sort of model. Matt, go ahead.
Man, and I love this whole like a discourse on modeling, and I feel like this will also probably be a part of like the variety engineering that like he goes into later, because that is like definitely a thing of like, yeah, any model is gonna highlight certain aspects of the thing in question and, you know, conceal others, and like they are very like application specific, and I bet that's gonna come up with like variety engineering stuff.
Yeah, I think so, because you're trying to organize something when you create the model and actually use variety intelligently. It kind of reminds me of like the people who are like, yeah, can't we just like have a game that is like it looks like a Ubisoft AAA Assassin's Creed game and is also exactly like this level of sophistication of Dwarf Fortress? No. For reasons of variety, right? Like, that's just, it's too much. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to harp on that, the whole thing of it being more than analogy, right? Like the metaphor versus metanim thing. But the model train here is interesting because, like, it's not that the model train is like a train; it is a train. Like, as in the feature they're controlling for is trainness, as in it is a train of objects that are coupled to each other. That's what a train really is. But in our minds, we always think of, like, the trains we're familiar with, always specifically either steam engines or the particular trains that happen to go around our country or our city, right? And we might be thinking of, like, well, the toy train clearly isn't one of those, but it very much is. Because the feature they care about is it being a chain of things that is pulled from the front. They don't really care about, like, oh, well, when I go on the train, it's like the chairs are soaked in vomit, and, like, the toy train doesn't have vomit chairs, so how could it possibly be a real, this is a little train. You're getting lost in the wrong kind of details. The details you care about are the ones that are transferred into the new domain.
Right.
The details you don't care about, such as vomit chairs, they don't come with you.
Yeah, Saturday morning train simulator has yet to be constructed with smell-o-vision. But yeah, there are different dimensions of trainness that people are actually interested in, but it makes them no less part of trainness. Okay, cool. So he says, no one complains that these models are mere analogies as long as the aptness of the model is properly defined. Now, the criticism of the organization chart as a model of the firm is that it is not appropriate as modeling those aspects of the firm we most wish to understand, which have to do with control. They have to do with control. They don't have to do with apportioning blame. And control here in the sense of, like, regulation, not in the sense of the tyrant controlling the organization. In all fairness, the unfortunate chart did not set out to be that kind of model. The trouble is that, since this is the only model we have, people insist on trying to use it inappropriately. It is as if we poured paraffin into a plastic model of a jet airliner in the hope that it would fly. It's like, yeah, no. It follows from these considerations that if we wish to think about control in the firm, we should use a control system as a model. Control systems, as was explained at the outset, are the topic of study of the science of cybernetics. The trouble is that control systems of sufficient complexity to serve as adequate models of the firm are themselves so complicated that cybernetics does not fully understand them except through models. So, again, we can't build a model of the firm from first principles. We can isolate the general principles of cybernetics that he's described at the beginning of the chapter, but that doesn't give us the capacity to build a model of the firm from first principles because it's too complicated. So we're going to rely on models to help us get there, to bootstrap something. In other words, cybernetics is actually done by comparing models of complex systems with each other and seeking the control features which appear common to them all. These invariant features, as it were, the laws of controls itself, certainly do exist. They can be invoked in the design of any controlling mechanism for any system, and we saw some of them used like that earlier, in Chapter 2, for example. But although fundamental rules of the game are an enormous help, and although they are neither arbitrary nor archaic, they are not enough. So I think that the problem of postmodernism would be to declare that these are actually arbitrary. Because the system is so complex, these general principles that you're pointing to are actually arbitrary. And they don't actually mean anything. But Beer is saying, no, they are not arbitrary, they're not archaic, but they're also not appropriate for grappling with this problem in its entirety. Matt, go ahead.
I was actually just thinking of like the difference between like there've been kind of two reactions to the realization that you never really get reality. Like you never really get the thing in itself or whatever. You either just throw your hands up in the air and do the postmodernism response, and nothing matters, and nothing is true. Or like I think there are more constructive ways from like epistemological constructivism, just sort of understanding that like our understandings are like created and maintained by like our brains and our social systems, and we're kind of subject to those dynamics. And also like related but not identical instrumentalism in philosophy of science, just like we're just trying to make stuff that makes predictions. Like even if you go into quantum and you see this whole like strict orbitals thing in an atom. It's not kind of not how it works. But you can. But if you're just trying to do some chemical engineering, like you can design good drugs like with 1/10 of the math, and it's the exact same results. And like why not do that? And I think also like I think Bogdanov also like puts like the finest point on it and just says it's all about coordinating social labor. And so like if these models like help you coordinate the kind of social labor you're trying to do, then like good.
Yeah, it's kind of like the distinction between pragmatism and postmodernism, right? In terms of like describing approaches. Okay, let's keep going. So, when we criticized existing approaches to management theory as arbitrary and archaic a little while ago, we also found them lacking in structural adequacy. This third matter remains a problem because natural laws have to be obeyed, they will be in any case, but they tell us nothing about design. Right? The natural laws in themselves don't even necessarily suggest what the problem is. So it's that's a very interesting point. So he says, suppose we were the architects of a building, we might know about the law of gravity, we might know about thermodynamics, but we are no nearer to setting the building's design because we do not know yet what it is for or how it will be used. Similarly, we could set out here many statements about the things that can and cannot be expected to work in the management of a business on the basis of cybernetic laws, but we should be no nearer specifying the basic design of its management structure or method of working. And that I think this is maybe a bit of a mistake that people get with the VSM, actually, is that the VSM is a model and seems quite useful, but it isn't itself the organization you're seeking to create. So, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, I think there's a kind of temptation to just use it as a blueprint of like, hey, look at this, these are boxes, and if we fill in all the boxes, then we'll be golden. But no, you absolutely have to have something intentional in mind, right? Like there has to be some purpose that it's oriented towards.
That's where kind of like the art in management design comes in, or in actual like practical applied cybernetics comes in. He then goes through animal ecology. He says animal ecology is quite chancy. So it's prone to very serious disruptions, like plagues and so on. Artificial ecology, an economy, but he's like, well, our economy sucks, so why would we use that as a model, right? Like national economy. It's like, but we said that the control system to be modeled ought to be recognized as highly successful. It's like, no, not that. No, let us not be too coy. It can hardly be accidental that so many anatomical and physiological terms, descriptions, and comparisons have already appeared in this book. The fact is that the firm is very much like an animal, let us say a human body. The comparison is very obvious and could be extended in a literary way at great length. but we are not interested in comparisons, but in models, and we ought to be scientific rather than literary. I think this is a really important point. Because it would be quite possible to take the human body as a model and then say, okay, let's reason from that and just do that. And many people have done that, right? And the problem is that you can, if you're just using literary analogizing, you can run into very flawed models of what the body actually suggests, right? Because you end up in like ideas about like, oh yeah, you got the brain, it controls everything. It's like the monarch who runs the country, blah, blah, blah. You get the Leviathan model of the monarch who is the people. And, you know, all kinds of like, you know, sort of Nazi organic polity models and this kind of stuff. Literally, in sort of the high militarist period in Japan, leading into World War II, the nation was referred to as the kokutai, which is to say the national body, and that was you know, led to these really like sort of authoritarian theories. But if you try to approach the body in a scientific way, and the modeling in a scientific way, you may actually arrive at some new insights that don't simply confirm your biases and how they're expressed in literary metaphors. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna raise that sort of stuff of like the kind of Nazi style, like organic corporatism or whatever the fuck they called it, and like some people, especially on the left, get a bit kind of spooked by this kind of like organic metaphors or like using kind of organic systems as what beer is doing here, right? Like trying to extract these kind of features and even saying like that social systems, like above the level of the individual, they function the same kind of way because it does remind us a lot of that kind of stuff. It's something to always be on guard against, right? Are we just using a kind of romantic analogy, or are we being properly scientific about extracting the real invariant features of a thing? But yeah, and also say that this doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going back to fucking Nazi weirdness or like or the sort of those kind of smoke screens of justification, right? That kind of romantic, kind of naive kind of interpretations of bodily metaphors and such. That's always something to be on guard against. Just when he's talking previously about why ecology isn't a good model, is that these ecological systems are not self-aware in the way that we care about, right? And like I think as you go up the stack from like just like physical matter through to like you know, base organic sort of stuff and up through societies, you get more and more reflexivity, right? Like you get more kind of ability for the system to turn back on itself and operate upon itself. And for ecology, it's not super self-aware. It's kind of maybe self-aware at the level of the genome, like being vaguely kind of self-directing, but not entirely. So that's not the stuff that we care about. Like beer's ears prick up when you get to the realm of things that are self-aware, right? Like systems that have these feedback loops that make them reflexive in this way that we care about, and that becomes more so at the social level, right? Like biological systems can be self-aware in this way, but there's potential for social systems to be even more kind of absurdly aware of themselves and more reflexive. I just thought that was a little interesting tidbit there that he kind of passes over just base ecology as like it's not really worth using as a model because it's not self-reflective.
Well, it's interesting in that sort of context to think about Beer's pond computer, right? That it was intended to be an ecological system that was self-aware, but obviously that's an engineered thing rather than simply an ecology that you would find out there. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay. I think he talks about sort of like the excellences of the body, some of the things that Lauren brought up earlier. He also talks about survivability as a criterion, which was brought up in the previous parts of the book. And then he gets on to something else. Let us not undertake this effort, however, without some careful reflection on the foregoing arguments about the nature and utility of the model we intend to construct. Could a neuro-cybernetic model really tell us anything about running an enterprise? Is there really a brain of the firm? There can be no interest in analogy at this point. A useful model, as already discussed, must be able to handle differences in scale, transference, workability, and appropriateness in convincing style. The rest of the book shall speak for its success in these terms, just as so many real-life applications have already attested to its potency in the diagnostic context. But there is something more to grasp quite firmly if the mistaken notion that we are dealing with an analogy is not to recur to the user of this work with concomitant unease. That is the concept of invariance, which first came up a few pages ago. It is a mathematical term whereby it is said that one thing is invariant with respect to something else. That is, it does not change as the other thing changes. In legally conducted business, the assets must be greater than the liabilities. This inequality is an invariant of all trading companies. It does not matter whether we're dealing in steel or soap. The opposite inequality is called bankruptcy, and that is an invariant too. Our neurocybernetic model pursues and hunts down organizational invariances in large, complex, probabilistic systems within the methodology of model building already noted. How does such a system operate effectively if its components are unreliable? It turns out that there are invariant rules governing such a system which may be derived from the theory of probability and expressed mathematically. It does not matter whether we are dealing with a brain or a firm. If it does not matter, people ask, what was the inducement to use a neurocybernetic model at all? The answer to that is that the human enterprise is in a very unsatisfactory condition. Its record of failure is mounting in the face of environmental change, and no one can be sure which aspects of organizational wisdom are conducive to viability and which to disaster. The human nervous system sometimes fails as well, but it seems to have resolved many problems the enterprise has not yet solved. It ought to be successful, of course, because of such long-term investment in its structure, and we should be ready to learn from those several million years of research and development. Okay. Let's talk about this. I think this is really important. I think what Beer is saying here is quite contentious on many levels. Okay, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it checks out. You know what I mean? Like it's especially important that he's focusing on the invariant features, right? That like it's all of this, like 'cause there will be objections that there's stuff that doesn't transfer, and he's just not interested in the stuff that doesn't transfer. Yeah, and I think I don't know. Like I'm kind of already basically sold on the pitch here. Like it's maybe there's something that's not jumping out at me as being maybe a problem.
Okay, but, just to sort of like lay it out, it's like, well, okay, so we have invariants.
Mm-hmm.
The invariants do not suggest a model in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's something Beer asserted already.
Right.
The neurocybernetic model pursues and hunts down organizational invariances in large, complex, probabilistic systems. Okay, fine, but those don't imply a model. So, like, why? Okay, it's like the invariant in this sense is like a product of the model, like in the way that is knowable to us.
Right, yeah.
Which is an interesting thing. It's not like you go do separate research, come up with the organizational invariants, and then build a model based on them. You develop a neurocybernetic model that is going to hunt down organizational invariants.
Yes, right. That's true. That is the case. Yeah, there's something troubling about the formulation.
Matt,
it's somewhat recursive.
Matt, go ahead.
A slightly bong rip, but I feel like for like the layer of abstraction where Beer is really focused on, you probably could map most of the VSM onto like Caterpillar's species being, but like maybe you could say that like for his objects of interest, it's whether there is a system 3 star. because the thing is, like, for your body, there actually is like your immune system, can do all kinds of crap to, like, check if like a cell, might be a little cancerous or have a virus in it and stuff. Like, it actually can like really audit, but caterpillars as a species can't. Like, there's no way that because they're distributed all over a place, and like so something that's tightly coupled enough that like you actually could do that is maybe that's its object of interest.
Right, and so using the neurocybernetic model would allow us to reveal that as a important criterion for viability in organizations, because it's important to the viability of neurocybernetic organisms generally. I guess is kind of the assertion here, so he says it's not about analogy, it's about the model, it's about the invariance. The model is going to get us the invariance. Why use the human neurocybernetic model? It succeeds at things that our organizations don't. So he's like, well, yes, we could build a neurocybernetic model on the basis of our existing organizations, but they're really bad. We can obviously see that they're bad. They're failing in all these ways. Let's not start there. Let's start at something that works. And the thing that works is humans, and it's the result of a long-term investment in evolution. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about this. I wonder if he's also kind of riffing on Ashby's bit about the contrast between shells and brains, right, as devices for regulating crucial variables in an organism, right? So you have the turtle wants to keep its blood volume pretty much constant, so it uses a shell as a regulator to do that. Whereas an ape or like a person or whatever, a fencer is the kind of or a swordsman is the example that Ashby uses, wants to keep their blood volume pretty constant as well. But the regulator they use to do that is the brain. And in Ashby's model, it's as if the brain were wrapped around the outside of the organism rather than being encased inside it. That the brain is the ultra high variety interface between the crucial variables on the outside. And the thing is that the fencer vastly outperforms the tortoise with his shell. Like it's in the same sense that like the midday sun is so much brighter than the stars that it's not just brighter, it's so much brighter that they all disappear from view, right? That like these brains gigantically outperform fucking everything else that we know of, and so they're the kind of obvious object of study for this. But I do take Kyle's point that there's something a little bit kind of self-recursive about the argument, right? Like we're going to use a model to just discover invariants that would suggest a model, or there's something a little bit troubling about it. I think you're muted, Kyle.
Thank you. It's okay to bootstrap your understanding in that way. It's just like I just want to be clear about what beer is doing.
Sure.
Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we're having with some like nagging suspicions of like like is this really the way to go? Yeah, like I guess like we don't really know. I think everyone like deciding to dive into the book is already kind of minimally like the idea seems to make enough intuitive sense, but like you gotta be careful about like like that being. The guide, like minimally, you shouldn't put it into dogma just yet, because I mean, like lots of things make intuitive sense. Heavier objects falling faster than lighter objects, like that makes total sense. Like that is a very reasonable like thing to conclude.
Yeah.
Personally, like what I'll go back to is like how like things really were like going well in Chile, you know, up until the coup. And you know, like beer was really good at doing the management consulting. And so like, but you know, like you know, people who are really good at things aren't necessarily good at explaining why they're good at them. So you know, like we don't really know how much of that was really crystallized into the VSN. But you know, so you know. I think we can have enough subjective confidence to explore it and maybe like try to create some little organizational experiments to really like flesh out like certain aspects of it. But not necessarily put it on too much of a pedestal yet.
Yeah, it's more like what I'm trying to get a definite grasp on is Beer is cautioning us very strongly against analogizing, and yet he's developing an understanding by way of a model, and that is a very tricky framework to work in because you might think that working from a model implies analogizing, but I don't think that's what he's saying. So that's all I'm kind of getting at. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with all that. I think maybe one of the things we're sort of concerned with in the background here is the risk of like anthropocentrism or anthropomorphizing in using the human nervous system as the bootstrap stage 0 to get to our understanding. There's this huge risk that you'll actually just never get past stage 1, right? Like that it will just always kind of be haunted by this kind of familiarity with the thing. And I think where beer ends up is somewhere healthy, where having bootstrapped out of this very familiar analogy, we end up with a concept of viable systems and of like this kind of neurocybernetics as not actually being peculiar to human beings. It's a general feature of all kinds of systems. It's a general feature of the world, really. I think that's where beer wants us to get to, is that like we'll use our common understanding of human stuff to get to a point where we recognize all these features that we often consider to be uniquely human as actually being general features of the world.
Yeah,
but the risk is always there that we won't actually get there, you know?
How can we say that those things are... When we identify... So, say we identify the features of human that work well...
Mm-hmm.
You know, sort of like using that fencer example that you were talking about. And then how can we point to organizations and say they do this well without analogizing to the way humans do things well? Because that seems to be why beer is saying that we should use the human body, because it's good at doing things and we can analogize to it. That's just what's driving my brain a bit fuzzy. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think maybe there's an angle in like an analogy versus an abstraction, like and like beer is definitely very into like these layers of languages, because like any relation between two objects, or even like saying that they're two different objects is kind of a violation of like the particularities of two objects. Two caterpillars can be very different. Even saying that they're the same species, or saying that they're both caterpillars is still an abstraction. So like I think maybe that's what he's saying, is that a human is just an instance of this more general like class of things, and so it might be analogizing if you go from business to business to human. But like, it's not analogizing to say that like these are both instances of like system 3 or whatever.
So then, is the real issue that you're incautiously abstracting when you analogize? Rudy, and then Shane.
So I think that you're all pointing at a good problem, which is, like, I read recently Notes on Technology by Bogdanov, and he does this all the time, where he says, well, these two things look similar if you squint your eyes, so they must be doing exactly the same thing. And beer is he still is guilty saying, and you see it all the time in complexity theory, like, well, these two things look kind of similar because they showed similar patterns. So obviously a neuron is similar to direct percolation of insect fly. So obviously turbulence behaves like predator-prey models. And it's not apparent at all.
Right, thank you. That's a very good example. I also am, another thing that's really brought to mind here is the way in Murawski's book on cybernetics and economics, he criticizes agent models for doing improper analogs. And yeah, I mean, that's a really long argument that he makes, but it seems like he's getting at a similar point where it's like, this is actually an unfounded analogy. Shane and then Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe pull an example from the text. So if we go back to page 86, the page before the end, in the middle we have control is integral and control is intrinsic. And then he goes through kind of two vague examples of the body and the firm. And these are examples that point us in this general direction, but the statement itself has nothing to do with either the body or the firm. It's a complete abstraction. Like it's just a thing about control. And then you have these instantiations of like examples of it, and like, yeah, we're being asked to like make the connections across the domains in this kind of way. But the point is not the body analogy or whatever. It's to get to this concept of control being integral, and it happens to be that nervous systems are kind of pretty damn good at doing this kind of integration, and they exemplify this property of being intrinsic rather than being transcendental, like that they're inside the system being controlled. So yeah, he does bounce back and forth between two domains to make the kind of comparative analogies, but I think the points that he's trying to get to are always general.
Right. I mean, and it's okay to think dialectically like this.
Yeah,
I'm just,
totally.
yeah, I'm just saying, you know, what's going on. Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for like a good example to keep in mind of like overgeneralizing is there's this amazing deep learning researcher Geoffrey Hinton at University of Toronto, revolutionized machine learning. But like he'll occasionally say things like, "Oh yeah, back propagation exists in the brain," and just no, we don't know that. Maybe the fact that it works for artificial neural networks is maybe a reason to look for something like that anatomically. But you can't just you can't just say that. You don't know that.
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind the way in which researchers have taken to modeling physical systems as information processing systems in physics, like very commonly now. So, for example, a black hole is analyzed as an information processor, and that's used to assert properties of black holes. And I guess you kind of need to go through experiment and comparison to other findings in order to find out whether that analogy really holds. But I guess there's properties of information processing that are not inherent to computers, which you can use to analyze those things. I'm just saying this is a very tricky thing, and I am skeptical of the degree to which humans actually are able to purely abstract without resorting to the analogs. Shane.
Yeah, definitely right. It's I'm very skeptical of the kind of we can reach towards it, but I don't think we'll ever really get there. The information processing computing thing is interesting because I don't know if it's in this book or is it in a different beer thing I was reading recently, but he does talk about how over the ages, we kind of use the most hot contemporary technology as our main analogy. So for some people, it's like, oh, steam engines are the metaphor for how the brain works, or and then later on it's electrical wires, and then later it's computers and stuff like that. But at each of those stages, we do discover something about the world in general, right? So like when we use the computational analogy, it's definitely overstretched in a lot of domains, right? Like it's like, the market is a computer, this fly is a computer, all this kind of stuff, and the analogies are overstretched. But we do kind of discover that computation is in some ways a general feature of the world rather than being something specific to beige box computers. So it's a bit of a both thing, right? Like we do discover these are general features, but the analogy doesn't carry us all the way either. Like it's never quite the silver bullet that will describe reality, but it does give us some notion that the feature is more general, right?
And I think a thing that I'm kind of getting at here is that going off of Pickering's performative model, I think that a performative understanding of reality is fundamentally analogous.
Right, sure.
Because you aren't asserting what's behind things as abstract principles that are absolutely determinative. You are trying to make analogies between performances. And so, I mean, yeah, that's just a thought I had. So, Pickering's read of beer seems to be a little bit at odds with what beer is saying here. But I'm interested. I'll let this go, and I'm interested to see where it goes further in the book. I just wanted to have an extended discussion about that because it seems like a really fundamental point of scientific methodology that beer is asserting here.
I agree.
All right, so that does it for the chapter. We're going to go on to hopefully a somewhat shorter discussion in chapter 7. Sorry for keeping you all so long with that. Thanks for attending, everybody. I really appreciate all your participation. It's been super thought-provoking.
It's been wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.